Thanks for coming, everybody. How's the microphone position there? Good? Okay. Okay. Yeah, I understand this is being streamed, so I should have told my mother, but I didn't. So thanks so much for having me. It's been a real pleasure to be here. I hadn't been to Rutgers before today, and it's been really just lovely to chat with lots of you. Thanks especially to the graduate students for showing me around and keeping me on more or less on schedule. Today I'm going to talk about some slightly older work, some pretty recently published work, and some work that's in progress. My funny title is, of course, alluding to one of Minnesota's most famous exports, Nobel laureate and general kind of weird guy, Bob Dylan. So I'm from this funny small liberal arts college. This is actually Macalester, but also how all small liberal arts colleges appear in college materials. This is, of course, how people imagine Macalester and Minnesota to be at all times. And I put this in as sort of a joke, but jokes are only ever funny because they have some kernel of truth to them. And indeed, yesterday, before I got on the plane, this is what happened. We had like our first little warning that winter is making its way to Minnesota. The work that I am going to show you here today is obviously not all things that I have done just sitting by myself in my lab. It's work that I've done with undergraduate collaborators. Macalester is an undergraduate liberal arts college, so no graduate students, but I work with lots of lovely people. These are just some of them. So some of my more recent students are Kelsey and Jeffrey and Maddie. Not everyone's name ends in E, but these guys do. And then my good friend and collaborator, David McGee, who's at MIT, and one of his current almost finished graduate students. So I love collaborating with these folks, the undergrads, and also David and his lab. And so this is kind of our collective work that I'm going to share with you today. So I'm going to try to touch on 4 things. Hopefully it's not too ambitious. The first is a little just review of wind-driven upwelling and what that's about, and the strength and position of the major wind belts and how they have to do what they do during abrupt climate events. I was told that sometimes undergraduates attend these seminars and graduate students who perhaps are not focused on paleoclimate. So hopefully it's not too much review, but it's just enough to get everyone on the same page. Then I'll talk about some specific examples. So effects of cooling events on the trade winds, using cores from the African margin, effects of these events on the westerlies in the Southern Ocean, and then talk a little bit about connections between the Southern Ocean and areas farther afield. So hopefully this is a familiar diagram for most of you. These are just the major circulation cells in the atmosphere, and they're driven by the fact that the equatorial regions absorb more direct sunlight than anywhere on Earth, and it fuels these Hadley cells, so air is rising at the hot equator and sinking in the subtropics, and the return flow form the trade winds. And the trade winds are going to be kind of the subject of my first little example. The next cells to the sort of north and south have surface winds that go in the opposite direction. And even though they are pointing to the east, we call them the westerlies because, as you probably all know, we name things from the direction that they come from. These cells right now shift with the seasons because their position depends on the temperature gradient between the equator and the poles. So we think we have observed 2 changes happening today because of climate change. One is that Arctic warming is lessening the equator to pole temperature gradient in the northern hemisphere, and so we see weaker westerly winds in the northern hemisphere. And Antarctic cooling is steepening the temperature gradient in the southern hemisphere, and so we have a southward shift of the westerlies, and I'll circle back at the end of my talk to why that might be an important feedback for anthropogenic climate change. So the position of this sort of band of rising air and lots of precipitation we call the intertropical convergence zone, the ITCZ, and this is just showing sort of the range of variability of where we find it in peak northern hemisphere summer and peak southern hemisphere summer you can see that its position is quite variable. And this has big implications for those cells to which it is kind of the divider. This is a nice piece from Nature talking about, again, sort of modern effects on circulation. What I want to show, of course, is that the real world is much messier than these funny little diagrams. And so what we're, this is very slow on here. What we're actually looking at, of course, are things that look like this. So if we look at an Atlantic example, since I'll mostly talk about the Atlantic, they're not nice, neat little swooping lines all going in kind of parallel swoops, but there's a lot of small scale variability, but you can still see kind of the trade wind belt, generally speaking, in both the northern and southern hemispheres. I'll just, spoiler alert, skip ahead. The westerlies get really complicated, but they are, as you can see by the sort of brightness, they're really, really strong, and they therefore have the potential to draw up a lot of subsurface water. So, yeah, that's just right now. Yeah, it's a nice day to not be there. All right. So, talked a little bit about winds and why we have them, these sort of big scale patterns. How does this work? Well, one way, kind of the most common way that this works is as wind blows parallel to some coast, we have Ekman transport acting to the right of the wind direction, and if the orientation to the coastline is correct, then it pulls water away from the coast and brings up water from below. So that water that's down below has a couple characteristics that we want to keep in mind. It's usually noticeably colder than surface water, and it also has lots of delicious nutrients in it that have accumulated as organisms die and sink through the water column and are remineralized. So that this helps drive productivity in regions where water is upwelling from the subsurface. And we can see that here. So this is the region I'm going to be talking about. The trade winds, at least for part of the year, run more or less in that nice parallel orientation to the North African margin. And so they do a lot of wind-driven upwelling. And so there's this wind-driven upwelling productivity. You can also see some at the equator. All right, in the southern hemisphere westerlies are doing the work that you just saw, stirring things up, and similarly drawing water up from the subsurface. This is a crucial process on paleo time scales. As I mentioned, it's also relevant to the modern world, but the Antarctic is super important for thinking about the distribution of all kinds of things in the ocean, right? Carbon, nutrients, energy, salt, heat. And so the westerlies are sort of running here in a very schematic way and driving the Antarctic circumpolar current. And this essentially forms a boundary between an area where carbon is being taken up, both by simply dissolving it in cold water and also because of biological productivity. But then to the south, you have an area where upwelled deep waters are releasing carbon into the atmosphere. And so the position of this barrier, but also the strength of the winds and the strength of wind-driven upwelling is a regulator of the trade-off between taking carbon into the ocean and having carbon leave the ocean. So that's my little crash course in wind-driven upwelling. So now I want to consider what happens when we impose an abrupt North Atlantic cooling on top of these big circulation cells and their surface component winds. Why would we want to do this? Well, we have such events in the paleo record, the Heinrich events and the Younger Dryas. And these are short-lived events. They have sort of different origin stories depending on which one you're talking about and who you ask. But they are these short-lived cooling effects. We think that they do originate in the North Atlantic. One popular plausible model is by kind of a rapid massive ice shelf collapse. And so that has a couple of effects. This is a really steep pointer gradient here, right? So as you move from the last glacial maximum into this period of iceberg discharge, you see effects on the strength of overturning circulation, at least perhaps think of it more as the geometry of overturning circulation. You see a change in subsurface temperature and a change in surface temperature. So surface temperature gets much colder, the subsurface temperature actually warms a little bit, so you have a fresh cap sitting on and insulating it. And this has all kinds of implications, but especially this surface cooling has a big impact on the equator to pole temperature gradient. And so that's going to have the effect of squishing all of those cells and shifting them to the south. These, of course, were originally, the evidence came from ice rafted debris belts, and so these have been recurring events. This is just a couple of them, so Heinrich events 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1, and then this here is the Younger Dryas, and they all have impacts on Greenland temperature, and then down here is the carbonate, and the carbonate are these grains that are being floated off by icebergs, taken from the continent and deposited in a nice little belt across the North Atlantic. So we see all kinds of responses in the North Atlantic, which we might expect, right? We see sea surface temperature, so sea surface temperature proxies here. From the North Atlantic, this is our kind of paleocirculation proxy, protactinium and thorium. So at the same time as all of these icebergs are being dumped into the North Atlantic, we see responses in temperature, we see responses in ocean circulation kind of local to the North Atlantic. But what I'm interested in is how do they kind of overlay onto other areas of wind-driven productivity, and what can that tell us about sort of nutrient and carbon circulation throughout the ocean? So one way we can try to address this is, of course, through the paleo record, and that's mostly what I'm going to talk about. But this is a nice piece of work that David McGee headed up in the last kind of 2 years, and it's a little proxy model comparison. And so what we did was to work with modelers and rope in some other unwitting paleoclimatologists and think about how this would work and what would a model predict that we should see in the sediment record throughout the Atlantic and then kind of throughout the rest of the ocean. So this part on the left is hemispheric symmetry. So we just have a couple of Hadley cells. You see they're rising in the tropics, sinking in the subtropics. You can look at the zonal winds, so westerlies and easterlies, and then this is the surface and kind of shallow circulation in the ocean. The part on the right is the model has imposed a cooling on the northern, kind of the northern end of the model, right? So in the North Atlantic, and a warming in the south, and this is basically meant to mimic the change that we would see during a Heinrich event. So if this isn't compensated somehow by radiative balance or heat storage in the ocean, then the model responds by moving heat from the southern hemisphere into the northern hemisphere. How it does that is by actually moving it in the upper limb of the Hadley cell, because that's where the sort of total moist static energy is the greatest. So that's the combination of, think of sort of latent heat as well as all of the other things. So this is actually the most efficient way to move heat from the south to the north. So that has the effect of you have to kind of scoot this cell over into the southern hemisphere to let it move heat from the south to the north. So the surface expression also shifts to the south, and it strengthens, again, to replace the heat that's sort of been imposed as a deficit in the model. So this does what we might then expect, which is as you strengthen the surface wind circulation, you also strengthen ocean circulation. And it predicts that we would have strengthened trade winds in the northern hemisphere, but reduced trade winds in the southern hemisphere. So that's funny. Why would that happen? Imagine that you have your sort of ring of circulation sort of a ring belt around the Earth, and it's being moved by Earth's rotation, right? And it's being moved in, it has a westerly velocity, right? So if you displace a ring like that poleward, then it is contracting, right? It's a little closer to Earth's axis of rotation, and so it will, to balance angular momentum, it will acquire extra westerly velocity. So what this is saying if you add westerly velocity, it's going to have opposite effects, right, in the northern and southern hemisphere. So in the northern hemisphere, by shifting your ring sort of farther toward the equator, you're acquiring this sort of east to west direction. In the southern hemisphere, you're doing the opposite. You're contracting a little bit, and so it goes in the opposite direction. So you would expect to see increased sort of wind-driven upwelling in places like this in the northern hemisphere. You would expect to see reductions in upwelling in kind of similar coastal locations in the southern hemisphere. And so this is a reasonably straightforward prediction to test. Modelers like to measure lots of things, and so they also looked at changes in precipitation, which are a little bit harder to test. But that's still what you see. You see that these are two different models run with the same set of conditions. You see that the northern hemisphere tropics dry out a little bit, and all of that moisture from the ITCZ shifts to the south. So this is, the model is doing what we think it should be doing, both in the sort of schematic way and in terms of precipitation. You can see the wind anomalies also line up with what we think, right? So increasing winds in this direction, east to west, or kind of northeast to southwest, but then increasing in the sort of northwest to southeast direction in the southern hemisphere. So how are we going to look for evidence of this in the paleo record? What kinds of things might record these processes? Dust flux and grain size are commonly used proxies to study wind strength, and those have pros and cons, right? They can be measured easily sometimes and inexpensively. They scale directly with wind strength, which is handy. You can also do, all kinds of, origin things with various isotope systems, but dust flux also varies with aridity of the source area. So it's hard to distinguish between increased wind strength and increased aridity of the source area of your dust. I spent all that time talking about upwelling, right? So changes in wind-driven upwelling also are impacted by changes in wind strength, but they're also impacted by changes in other stuff. So the nutrient content of the source waters, for example, being the most common one. So what we did in this study was to focus on either regions or ideally individual cores where there were at least two different kinds of proxies for each, some kind of more physical process, maybe some kind of more biological process, and no like fancy statistics, basically, like do these things kind of change in the same direction? How much evidence do we have? So that's what we did. So you can see the results here, and they do kind of confirm what the model predicts. So our kind of the size of our dot here is our number of different types of proxies, and so you can see there are a couple where we have low confidence for a variety of reasons. But in the northern hemisphere, for the most part, the places where we see wind-driven upwelling today, we see an increase. And in the southern hemisphere, where we see wind-driven upwelling today, we see a decrease, again, during this kind of Heinrich events or even last glacial maximum. The caveat, of course, as you can see, is that we need way more coverage in the Southern Ocean and also more coverage in the Pacific. And that's, when we started on this project, the Southern Ocean, I guess, I understand is like, it's a big ocean. It hasn't gotten perhaps the attention that it should, but I thought for sure the Pacific, we would be able to find more, at least of these regions where we would have enough different kinds of proxies that we could make some reasonably confident results. And it's just not the case, which is, a signal that someone needs to do some work. Someone is not me. So this is zooming in just on the North Atlantic, and as an example of what we mean by having these coherent changes in a bunch of different proxies. So the arrow here is just telling you about this is the temperature gradient, northern hemisphere, southern hemisphere temperature gradient. So age is down here, going from the last glacial maximum to 5,000 years ago, and here's Heinrich Stadial 1 and the Younger Dryas. And so during both of those times, you have big North Atlantic coolings. The temperature gradient goes way up. This is when we expect stronger northern hemisphere trade winds. And so what do we see? We see sea surface temperature decrease during particularly the Younger Dryas. It was kind of already quite cold during HS1. So this is from the Cariaco Basin. So the colder surface temperatures are what we would expect if we're increasing upwelling. We can look at dust fluxes. This is from the northeast subtropical Atlantic. So dust fluxes increase, opal fluxes increase, organic carbon fluxes increase during these cold events, and sea surface temperatures on the African margin also increase during these events. So the North Atlantic, because it's so heavily studied, gives us a really nice test of this model prediction, and then some of the other locations as well. So I'm going to zoom in even further on the African margin and talk about just a few slides about the response in this particular region, which is highly biologically productive, but in a fairly narrow little range. So what we're looking at here on the left is the subsurface, not concentration, but calculated SI star. So that's the concentration of silicate minus the concentration of nitrate. And the reason to look at this is it's kind of a nice way of thinking about basically do diatoms have enough of both of those things? So where SI star is positive, there's enough silicic acid that diatoms are not going to run out of it when using silica and nitrogen up in a 1-to-1 ratio. So you can see that there's lots of available silica sort of up here, or at least kind of enough. And as you get farther to the south, the subsurface waters are a bit depleted. So this is one of these factors, right, that's going to combine with wind-driven upwelling to control productivity. The productivity that we see is here. This is chlorophyll concentration. And these obviously are our cores. The northernmost one is up in 30 degrees, and then this is the southernmost one. It's about 19 degrees. And again, the productivity is pretty tightly tied to the coastline there. These are the same cores, just to explore the difference in summer and winter. So we can think of winter as our sort of Heinrich 1 analogy. And during winter, the trade winds really line up in just really nicely parallel to the coast. So you bring up cold water. That's when you get most of the productivity. During the summer, the winds are not quite as strong. The alignment with the coast isn't quite as direct, and so upwelling is reduced. Sea surface temperatures are warmer because it's summer, but also even relatively warmer because upwelling is weakened. So this is our little setting. What did we do? So this is work that I did mostly at Macalester with my undergrad band of collaborators. So we were measuring biogenic components of sediment. So we were measuring opal using the sort of usual alkaline extraction method. We were measuring carbonate and organic carbon with a coulometer. We were working with David McGee to look at the terrigenous fraction. So he's doing some uranium series chemistry, as well as, for this project anyway, we did some grain size end member modeling, because as close as we were working to the coast, you could reasonably have river input that would also show up as terrigenous sediment. These are thorium normalized fluxes, so I'm not going to go over thorium normalization, but the basic idea is that thorium-230 is a daughter product, and it's produced by uranium decay. And because uranium is nice and well mixed in the ocean, there's a constant production rate of thorium-230. So we can use that to let us know if there are times when there's kind of more sediment building up than we might expect, or if there's less than we might expect, and then to correct for it. The age models are radiocarbon-based for all of these cores. So this is the kind of multi-proxy, yes, but also different kinds of proxy approach that we want to have if we're going to think about the effect of wind, or perhaps not, on biological productivity from upwelling. So there's a bunch of axes here. So dust flux is on the right, and opal flux and organic carbon flux are on the left. The opal is in black, organic carbon's in red, and our little radiocarbon dates are the black dots. And these are organized from north to south. So our northernmost core has not as nice a sedimentation rate, and then we get down to the south where it's more productive. We got a better sedimentation rate and better resolution. So what happens during the Younger Dryas and Heinrich Stadial 1? Certainly during the Younger Dryas, you see a response in at least 3 and perhaps all 4 cores. And during Heinrich Stadial 1, the sort of one core that's well enough resolved to pick it up also shows a big response in dust, in opal, and in organic carbon. So it's telling us that something is bringing more dust in. It could be simply that North Africa was more arid. But when we combine that with the fact that we have these increases in biogenic fluxes, the sort of simplest and most plausible explanation is that wind strength was higher, and or the position of the winds was more favorable for wind-driven upwelling. We took the Oscar Romero's record of sea surface temperature, also from 20 degrees north, and just put it with our data. You can see, especially with our highest resolution record, GC68 here, that's the southernmost one, the sea surface temperature data looks really, again, like a super nice match, right? So when we have high dust fluxes and high biogenic fluxes, we see cold sea surface temperature. I should have mentioned that's a reversed axis. So cold sea surface temperatures, these again are all things that point to wind being a really strong control on biological productivity at this site. This is a little sort of a difference of fluxes between sets of cores. So they're all kind of referenced to the southernmost core. So this is telling us about the gradient in opal flux, but by extension, productivity and upwelling over these time periods. And so what I hope stands out to you is that that gradient is really steepest, again, during Heinrich Stadial 1 and the Younger Dryas, which is exactly what we would expect if the trade winds have in fact shifted farther south. So you have much more upwelling in the southern sites than at the northern site, which is then kind of left behind. I was going to say left in the dust, but that would be a bad joke. Okay, so that's the African margin. I want to switch locales and talk a little bit about the Southern Ocean and how it's related in some ways to the low latitude productivity that I was just talking about, both through nutrient export, but also, again, linked by these big large-scale wind systems. So this is work that was happening kind of at the tail end of my graduate time at Lamont with Bob Anderson. This probably many of you anyway, have seen this paper before. The idea is that when northern hemisphere cooling shifts the ITCZ, it shifts the westerlies south and increases upwelling in the Southern Ocean. And we have CO2 being released because of increased upwelling in the Southern Ocean, and also silica and other nutrients escaping in intermediate and mode waters out of the Southern Ocean to the low latitudes. So the core sites for this are all in kind of the region of maximum dissolved silica in the modern ocean. And so silica is usually used up at the surface, but if we increase upwelling, we might expect then to see increased diatom productivity here. So in the Southern Ocean, this is what we see during Heinrich Stadial 1, which is pink bar number 1 here. We see increased opal fluxes during Heinrich Stadial 1 and the Younger Dryas. We see a ramping up of CO2 during both of those times. That's atmospheric CO2. We see a dilution of the atmospheric radiocarbon signal with old carbon, so stuff that may have been hanging out in the deep Southern Ocean or perhaps deep Pacific Ocean for a couple hundred years or longer. And then sea surface temperatures are also shifting during this time. So for this particular site, an increase in the westerlies is actually going to make it warmer because the Antarctic's a funny place. So Northern Hemisphere cooling, Antarctic warming, and an increased upwelling. This time, our different kinds of proxies are a little different. We still have opal flux telling us that nutrients are being brought up. And then we have CO2 being added to the atmosphere. We can look in the subtropics, where we should also expect to see a signal from this, which we do. So during, this is not highly enough resolved to pick out both events, but this is the sort of window that covers both HS1 and the Younger Dryas. We see higher opal fluxes. This is in the tropical Pacific, and we see a change, a decrease in delta C13, again indicating that you have some high nutrient water mass coming from somewhere, and we would argue from the Southern Ocean during this period of enhanced upwelling. So this pattern holds true as far back kind of as the age model holds up, and so we can look back in this longer record at earlier Heinrich events, and so this is just GISP2 temperature. But if we look down here at all of the Heinrich events, which are for Antarctica labeled with their Antarctic numbers, we have opal flux peaks in all of them. Again, the age model is getting a little wonky back here, but peaks in opal flux and just little increases in CO2 at all of those, as well as the Antarctic warming that you would expect. So this seems to be a pretty persistent response to repeated North Atlantic cooling events. And so this is, for me, was a pretty satisfactory explanation, but of course, if we were all satisfied with our explanations, then we would run out of jobs to do. So Naeli Meckler had a different idea about how this north-south connection was happening. So she suggested that the loss of glacial North Atlantic intermediate water, so the sort of glacial stand-in for North Atlantic deep water, might have allowed the upward transport of silica and also other nutrients from the deep ocean to just kind of come up to low latitude thermoclines and mix warm water down to reach southern source waters. So they suggest that the increased productivity that you see on, for example, the African margin in the low latitude is not coming from the Southern Ocean, but probably just from the deep depths of the low latitude oceans where it's being allowed to kind of come to the surface. So their record is here. So it goes back for several glacial cycles. So they've got the PCO2 record here. They have not measured opal for all of the samples. They have measured opal. Those are the red dots here, and then done core scanning and taken the natural log of the silica to aluminum ratio. And then they have other various proxies telling us about different things. But I guess what I want to point out is that this early reduction in glacial North Atlantic intermediate water formation is a universal aspect, we think, of deglaciations, and it's probably really central to the sequence of events that begins a glacial termination. And so if any peaks kind of as pronounced as we see during, for example, the Heinrich Stadials or the Younger Dryas ought to produce a glacial termination. They should produce a deglaciation if this is really linked in the way that they propose. So they have a little zoom in here, and you can see, both the Younger Dryas and HS1 have these very pronounced peaks in the silica to aluminum ratio. They also have opal flux records from other cores. So the question is then, does this sort of hold up when we compare it to other sorts of records? So I'm going to show you another slightly longer record. So this is ODP 658. So it's here, pretty close to our southernmost site from the previous study. This is work that's part of which is ongoing with Christopher Kinsley, David McGee's graduate student. So we have a nice age model for this record. Again, mostly radiocarbon tie points, but we've also kind of tuned it to a really well-dated dust record from the same region. So what do we see? So there are a couple plots here, right? So opal flux is here in the black. Organic carbon is in the light gray. I hope you agree that they are similar. This is important. Why is it important? Well, organic carbon can certainly come from diatoms, but it can also come from things that are not diatoms, right? And so diatoms are, at least in the tropics, our most prominent user of silica. So if we're talking about increasing the supply of silica, but not perhaps other nutrients, we might see a response in opal, but not in other organic carbon producing organisms. So they're similar, that's worth noting. Down here, we've got dust flux and also detrital flux. They didn't do grain size analysis on everything, but they're very similar. So at this site anyway, almost all of the detrital material is coming from dust. It's not coming from rivers. So what do we see when we look at these? We see a nice peak in the Younger Dryas in opal flux. We see a nice peak in dust flux. Sadly, this core is missing H1. You can kind of see perhaps things are headed that way, but we will just never know. So these are the detrital flux and opal flux lined up together, just so you can see the comparison a little bit better. And I think, there are certainly periods where they diverge a little bit, but for the most part, these are two very similar records, again, of opal flux and dust flux. And so I've highlighted on here the Younger Dryas, H1, but also the earlier Heinrich events. And for most of them anyway, they show increased opal flux as well as increased detrital or dust flux. So this, for me, sort of points to a common mechanism of forcing for both of those things. You wouldn't expect to see increased dust flux if you are bringing silica up from the deep ocean. This is in review. This is the dust flux data are from David's postdoc, or former postdoc, Charlotte Skonegski, and she's now at University of Paris, but she was working with David at MIT and has generated this really, really nice 240,000 year record of flux data and also dust flux data. Again, from right off the African margin. And so we can even take this farther back in time and look at just the sort of tight correlation between dust and opal on these even longer time scales. So in this region, those things seem to be pretty highly related. This is a sea surface temperature record that goes back a little farther than the Romero record. So our opal record is in blue. This is from very nearby core site, and they are not a perfect match, but the main features, the Younger Dryas and Heinrich Stadial 1, a couple other events, stand out as being fairly similar. It's not as nice a match as the dust flux, but it suggests that there's, again, probably a strong wind-driven upwelling component to this story. So I want to talk for a minute about the silica to aluminum ratio. So this is what the Meckler paper is using essentially as a proxy for opal flux. So they're using this as a proxy for opal flux, which is then a proxy for paleoproductivity. There's a problem in doing this. The assumption in this method is that aluminum is just kind of supplied at a constant rate to the ocean, usually in the form of dust. But here, we know that that's not the case, right? We know that aluminum, the amount of aluminum coming in is changing as the amount of dust flux goes up and down. So I did just like the crudest thing possible, which was to take the ratio between opal flux and detrital flux in our data. And so here's our opal flux for comparison, and here is opal flux to detrital flux in our data. And what I think is interesting is that their kind of silica to aluminum ratio looks a little bit like a hybrid of these two things, right? It doesn't look like the opal flux record, particularly when you go farther back in time, right? There are just big events that their silica to aluminum ratio doesn't capture. There are also events that it does capture, right? So this way of looking at the data suggests that, not surprisingly, because the dust flux is changing and the aluminum input to the ocean in this part of the ocean is changing, that the silica to aluminum ratio is not going to behave here the way that we would like it to if we want to use it as a stand-in for opal. So that's a thing to keep in mind. So this other idea, linking back to the Southern Ocean again, was that during these Antarctic warmings, so have a Heinrich event in the north and it causes an Antarctic warming, that we should have silica escaping from the Southern Ocean and making it to the subtropics. And so we can see whether we think that's the case. This is a splice together of two opal flux records from the Southern Ocean. So these are our big periods of upwelling in the Southern Ocean when we might expect counterparts in the tropics and subtropics, if that's really where it's coming from. And there are certainly similarities. Again, the Younger Dryas is a big one, but there are also a lot of differences, which I suggest is because the sort of primary driver for that African margin system is wind and not supply from the Southern Ocean. But they're not unrelated, right? Because those same wind shifts that are causing this upwelling to be increased off the Southern Ocean margin is still causing upwelling to be increased in the Southern Ocean. We can try in another way to constrain nutrient concentrations and silica concentrations in the Atlantic, and this is really nice work that Kate Hendry has been doing for probably now the last decade, using silicon isotopes. And so using the silicon isotopes in sponge spicules, she can reconstruct the silicic acid concentration in different parts of the ocean, right? So the South Atlantic is here, and 1,000 meters is in black, and the deep Southern Ocean is here. So we might look for, were there big changes across these events in the concentration of silica in the ocean, perhaps in these intermediate waters, not really so much, or at least not within her resolution in the very deep ocean. If we look over in the North Atlantic, her data are on the bottom here. Again, perhaps we have an increase in HS1, not really in the Younger Dryas. So I think, the take-homes are a few. These are complicated systems. And, as with all things, we want to resist as much as we can to have sort of single explanations for any of them. But I think this is, this question is also a nice example of why it's so important to take into account just a variety of different ways of trying to answer any of these questions. So including not just multi-proxy, but like different kinds of proxies in different places. And not just proxies, but thinking about what models can tell us both about questions to test, but also the mechanisms by which things might happen. And mechanisms are important. And, I'm at a liberal arts college. I'm in this funny interdisciplinary department. But this kind of work for me is gratifying and just fits right in with that model, because this means that people actually have to sort of talk to each other and listen to each other and figure out how to put all of these different pieces together. So here are a couple of take-home points. We can use models to predict changes in kind of paleo wind strength and position and heat transfer. And then we can test those predictions by combining proxies that tell us about different kinds of processes, so that we can rule out sort of all of the confounding effects, or we can start to try to rule out the confounding effects that they each have. And the Southern Ocean remains super important, and it connects all of the other pieces of the ocean. I think this is, I've had lots of really stimulating conversations about the Southern Ocean here today, and understanding this conduit is just so important, and thinking about, how much of the signal that we're seeing in the low latitudes is coming from the Southern Ocean, how much of it is more locally kind of wind-driven, and in some cases precipitation and temperature-driven. So these are questions that we'll continue to work on. But that is where I think I will leave it. So I want to thank you for coming and for having so many nice conversations with me today. And of course, my undergraduate collaborators, and some internal funding, and some people in lots of different departments who I like to talk to about these things, and of course, NSF for funding our work. Thank you very much. Yes.
So have you looked at net focuses and a lot of that early work on North Island, Flowin, and how much are you looking? Could it just be changes in the source region versus true upwelling?
Like, is the silica coming from the continent? Is what?
I'm sure a lot of it, most of it's wind. Can you quantify? I mean, you get, Canada's thing.
Mm-hmm.
Can you tease out what might be? Because the metal cyanide, I assume, dissolve if you use the open flux as well.
Yeah, the phytoliths are too hardy, I think. So I didn't count them. The Romero paper does look into that and sort of do a, I don't know if they did on every sample, but they looked through pretty carefully and found negligible input. So that's right in that kind of the southern little cluster of cores that we had there. That's where that core is from. So people do look, because that's a thing that we know occurred, at least in some places. I guess I couldn't rule it out for the more northern cores, but for the southern cores, I feel pretty good. Rick?
Yeah, have you thought about radiocarbon
for the upwelling? Yeah, that.
Sure, these eight models are assuming constant reservoir age. But if you're increasing upwelling, you're bringing essentially older water to the surface. So you could have an independent age model.
Mm-hmm.
Eight models in kind of radiocarbon age,
that would. Yeah, that would be ideal, and I think one way to do that would be, I think I showed, so in the age model for 658, right? This Rick Cellini's record, I would have to look. I think that's also, it's also based on radiocarbon, but I think it's far enough away that if we were to tune this record to that radiocarbon-based age model, I don't know if that would still be too kind of confounding, but it's a good idea. I think, for me, well, I'm not a radiocarbon expert, but that would be an interesting way to go about it. I think the interpretation would potentially get very complicated if you started switching the source of the water. But if we didn't, I don't know.
Well, essentially what you want to be looking for is just older
right.
surface reservoir ages.
Yep.
During minus one and younger drawing. So if you could find an age model independent of radiocarbon.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't think, I mean, there's not a high resolution, 018 record, for example, from this core. But that's a great idea. SilicaAluminum Ratio. I don't remember. Because they do, I don't remember being from the Caribbean. They do show other records, but I thought they were, maybe it was Western, it might be Western Atlantic, but they do talk about another set of records, but I don't remember if it was, right. But I don't remember if it was silica to aluminum or not. Yeah. It doesn't seem like the simplest explanation. Yeah, I agree. Thank you. Yeah.
That's great, Louisa. Thanks very much. Thinking about all kinds of things, but one of the things I'm thinking about is really fundamental. Maybe this is a question more for people who don't deal with sediment versus failure in R&D, but it's for me too. And that is, just as Liz was saying, you're critical of the silicon to aluminum ratio. Now that's an attempt to measure each individual sample down the sediment core and come up with some index that relates to flux. And concentration is not flux, right? So there, the way you explain it is that roughly speaking, the same amount of dust goes in. Virtually all the aluminum is associated with dust, and so when the silicon to aluminum ratio goes up, this is more biogenic silica production. But then what you were comparing in the bottom part of that same slide, you were showing some of your own data with accumulation rate. And maybe you can just get at the point of why is it that we don't measure accumulation rate every centimeter down a core all the time? Because this is a great, this is a fundamental question. What you'd like to know is how fast did this stuff pile up in the sediment, what concentration is it in the sample to measure. And yet, most of failure oceanography is based on concentrations.
Yep.
I'm wondering if you could talk about that basic question, and if there are any, what gets used now, you referred to some of them, but there are approaches that you could see in the future for getting more easily an idea of accumulation rate in sediments.
I mean, we're still
at the resolution that we need.
Well, that's the problem, right? Is resolution, and we had some success in a Southern Ocean record that I was working on with Katharina Billups in using the high resolution density measurements to at least calculate mass accumulation rate at a higher resolution. So these are the GRAPE, I think it is, right? The high resolution, sediment density down core scanning record. So density, yeah. So the density of the sediment, which you can use to then calculate a mass accumulation rate at a relatively high resolution. So that's that came out in March of this year. So that is a kind of a nifty approach to get at what you're thinking about. But aside from mass accumulation rates, which require knowing something again about age control and also the density of the sediment, the other thing you've got is thorium normalization, which is expensive and time consuming. It works really well, but it's expensive and time consuming. But I think, well, I could pull it up. I can show you afterwards if you're interested. But I think for cores where we have that kind of high resolution measurement, and you have some kind of high resolution age control. That's a pretty promising approach.
So follow up on that. I was just having this discussion earlier yesterday and earlier today, and I'm realizing that I don't quite understand this. Maybe this is getting into too much detail. But the thorium method depends on rate. We have uranium in the ocean. It's uniformly distributed. It has a really long residence time. So for millions of years, we found out to be more or less the same concentration. That means the production of thorium-230 is the same everywhere. Virtually all of it in any given water column should end up in the sediments.
Yep.
And so we should have everywhere a known accumulation rate of thorium that's equal to its production in the overlying water.
Yep.
And the only thing that should make thorium go up and down in accumulation rate in the sediments is if, well, one portion of it, the water column depth is different, so that's a little bit of difference for me. But also the way you're using it is that it will go up and down because that constant amount of thorium is being diluted to a different variable amount depending on what other stuff goes into the sediment, which is the bulk of the sediment, right?
No, it's being added to or subtracted from. Right, so you have this amount of thorium that you expect. If you see more, it's not because it's been concentrated. It's because you have thorium attached to other stuff that's come in. So particles that fell down through some other part of the water column, stole the thorium from over there, and moved it to your site.
Okay, so you're suggesting that the thorium is largely corrected for focusing.
Exactly.
Or winnowing.
Exactly.
But if you had no focusing and no winnowing, this would still be useful. I mean, that's the ideal situation.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
And then doesn't your
but yeah, then it's
accumulation rate doesn't change, but your concentration does. That's what I'm talking about. Varying concentration.
okay.
Diluting with different amounts of, let's say, 5 different parts.
Okay.
Is that
Sure. Yeah.
So, let's see. So mostly what you're measuring is concentration. Right? I'm wondering how much focusing and winnowing affects records versus other factors.
The answer is, of course, it just really depends where you are. I know that's not a very satisfying answer, but like some of the studies where, so there was Franco Marcantonio has done a bunch of work on this, right? And so you can find places where the effects are just not very big, and you can find other places where once you correct for those effects, the signal is entirely different. Yeah.
So there's an assumption there that focusing the thorium goes with the other particle types, or are you talking about sorting between POC, which is probably carrying most of the thorium, maybe, and carbonate sediments after deposition based on rate size or something?
Yeah, I mean, the carbonate, I have to think more about the carbonate question, because I think you're right that a lot of the thorium is on organic carbon and to a lesser extent opal. Yeah, I'd have to think about correcting in a different way for those things.
Basically, I'm getting back to your point of, we know thorium-230 works really well.
Yep.
How do we know it works really well?
By comparing, sediment trap studies, basically. So sediment trap studies, and then looking at, really kind of testing the reversible scavenging model with water column, so filtered water column measurements, and then, the stuff that's filtered out of them. And that's been a lot, some of the sediment trap studies are older, but a lot of this is like relatively new geotraces work. And before that, I think how we knew was modeling and kind of testing various scenarios with models. So Gideon Henderson did some of that work, and that was like 2000 or something that he had a paper out about that. And it's, for his paper, it's kind of plus or minus 30%. That's a big thing. It's shocking that is still like, when I say like, oh, this is working really well, like that's really good compared to whatever else we have, right? So I think the sediment trap studies and some of the geotraces work has maybe narrowed the margin of error a little bit. Any other questions? Yeah. Of opal? You know, opal's a funny thing, right? So almost all of it is dissolved on its way down through the water column, and for whatever reason, you know, there just isn't a lot of, or at least there doesn't seem to be a lot of preferential dissolution in one place or the other, because there's not, you know, an opal equivalent of the CCD, right? So when we look in, you know, if we look at productivity in the modern ocean and the concentration of opal or the flux of opal in surface sediments, it does pretty well. I mean, there's of course a reason that these are relative changes over time and are not linked back to some, you know, grams of carbon of primary production. But as far as giving us a pretty good idea about relative changes over time, yeah, of course it's always a thing to think about, especially on these longer time scales. So the residence time of silica is about 15,000 years. So, you know, certainly if the ocean had been more undersaturated than it is now, that might be more of a concern, but we don't, as far as I know, we don't have any reason to believe that that was the case, at least for the time scales that I'm working on.